Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I know it's a super busy time in the semester for everyone, but as always, the work of historians and the work of geopolitics and the work of Russian aggression goes on, right? And so I'm glad we're all here, and I've been looking forward to this discussion as I've been grading papers the last 3 days. I've really been looking forward to this discussion today. Before I introduce two of my favorite people and friends and scholars, I just want to, on behalf of the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies, I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is one of the sponsors of these conversations. This is part of a series of conversations that began earlier this semester that I'm told will continue into at least the next semester, designed to bring scholars and citizens and policy leaders together to talk about these issues, to bring history together with contemporary policy debates. And I know we're going to have a fantastic conversation today. I want to thank Professor Michael Kimmage, who I think was the moving force, who organized this. He was the macher who made this happen. Michael is not with us today. He just called me from Israel. Mary thinks she's exotic being in Berlin. Michael's in the Holy Land today, actually in a meeting, I think, with Russian scholars and other scholars from around the world talking about many of these issues. So he's over there. He won't be able to join us, but he will, of course, watch our recording. I believe he's one of the chief organizers of this series of conversations. So I want to make sure we give him the kudos he deserves for making this possible. Also, Altine Junasova, who is the staff person at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies, who's made this possible. We want to thank her. Okay, our two fantastic interlocutors today, discussants, are people who really don't need an introduction, but I'll introduce them anyway because it's fun. So Professor Mary Sarotte, who I feel like I've known forever, is the inaugural holder of the Marie-José and Henry R. Kravis Chair at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. She's the author of a number of major books. I won't list them all because that would take our entire session. Three of her most recent important books, and I define important as books that I assign to my students. Not 1 inch. America, Russia, and the Making of the Cold War Stalemate, her recent book that's gotten a lot of attention, well-deserved, on policymaking around NATO expansion at the end of the Cold War. Her book before that resonates with the picture behind her, The Collapse, the Accidental Opening of the Berlin Wall. And then the book before that, 1989, The Struggle to Create Post-Cold War Europe. I will say it's so much fun for me to see Mary working on the end of the Cold War. Both she and I started working actually on the 60s and 70s in Ostpolitik in that period. And I think it's naturally drawn her to further on in the chronology. So it's wonderful to have you here, Mary. Thank you for joining us. And of course, we also have Professor Serhii Plokhii, who is the Mikhailo Hrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. And he's also the author of so many books that it would take another seminar to list them all. I will just list some of the most recent ones. Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters. Let's hope that just remains a history, Serhii. Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Really interesting rethinking. I honestly had thought I had read all I needed to on the Cuban Missile Crisis till I read this book. Chernobyl, The History of a Nuclear Catastrophe. And then the book that's actually probably the most relevant for what we're talking about today, to some extent, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine, which was published in 2015. And Serhii, I think it's fair to say, is the leading scholar of Ukrainian history and the history of the region in the United States. And it's really delightful to have you on here, Serhii. I should say Serhii is dealing with Omicron, and so his voice is not great, so he's going to keep his words brief and concise and focused, and we're really appreciative of, in spite of the fact that you're under the weather, that you're joining us today. So thank you. So I thought the first question I would ask to get us started, and our format is the three of us will talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will take Q&A from the audience. There is a Q&A function that you can all see. I think everyone is familiar with the world of Zoom by now. There's a Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. And there's already a question in there, I see. Feel free to please do as Sarotte has done, and please put up your questions. We will get to those after our beginning conversation. We'll spend about 40 minutes talking, the three of us, and then we'll have 20 minutes, maybe more if we need it, to answer all of your questions. I will read your questions to our distinguished panelists. So Mary, let me get us started here. You've spent so many years of your life in the archives thinking about the Cold War from a U.S., German, European perspective. How has the war in Ukraine changed the way you think about Cold War history? How has it changed the work that you do?
Well, first of all, just thank you for the invitation today. Wonderful to be here with Jeremi, with Serhii. Thank you to Michael Kimmage, who's not here, for asking us to do this many months ago. And thank you to the participants for making time at this busy point in the year to talk about these important issues. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, as you rightly pointed out, Jeremi, in recent years, I've actually been working on post-Cold War history. And so personally, I've been thinking about this not so much in terms of how it changes our understanding of the Cold War, but how it changes our understanding of the consequences of the Cold War and what aspect of the consequences help to explain this event. Now, I could obviously talk about that until everyone on the Zoom loses the will to live. That's not my intention. So I thought I'd start with the punchline right up front, and then if you want, or if the audience wants, we can get into details. As you rightly said, I've been working on the end of the Cold War. I ended up writing a trilogy of books, although I did not mean to do that. But the questions were just so compelling. I was actually, for those of you who don't know me, I was actually studying abroad in West Berlin in 1989 when the wall that you see behind me was still here and not just a historical memory. And after that experience, which was obviously a very significant one, I realized I wanted to know in a serious way how and why the wall had come down, and how and why Germany, after decades of division, had managed to unify in 329 days. And so I wrote the two books that you were kind enough to mention. But in the course of that research, I came across documents related to the early history of NATO expansion. This was a surprise to me. At the time, there was a kind of conventional wisdom that NATO expansion had only come up in the 90s under Clinton. So I was surprised, and I put together an article based on those sources, and it got a lot of attention. I did another one, it got a lot of attention, and I thought, I should probably do a book on this as well. And that, of course, ended up being the book you were kind enough to mention, Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of Post-Cold War State, a lovely Christmas or other holiday gift for those of you still in the market. And as I was, working on that book, I realized if I'm going to do it properly, I'm going to need to get documents from the Clinton era as well, because I want to take the story up to the enlargement of NATO to Central and Eastern European states. So the book is based on sources up till 1999. And to get back to, as I said, the punchline, I'll spare you the process of reading the book. Basically, after all the research, it dawned on me that the big play at the end of the Cold War, in other words, the best outcome, the best consequences of the Cold War was to square the circle of three competing goals. Those were, first, enabling Central and Eastern Europeans to fulfill their goal of joining NATO, which was a perfectly justified request, right? They had bravely thrown off the yoke of Soviet oppression. They were new democracies. They were market economies. In other words, they shared the values of NATO. They were sovereign states. They had every right to ask to join NATO. So the first goal was to enable them to do that. The second goal was to find a way to keep cooperation with Russia going. And this matters a great deal because Washington and Moscow are the only cities on Earth with civilization-ending capabilities because there were command and control of strategic nuclear arsenals rest. And there was an astonishing moment of nuclear disarmament in the early 90s, the biggest since the dawn of the atomic age. And it was in the interest not just of Washington, not just the United States, but of the entire world, that process go as far as possible. Imagine how different it would be now if all of the strategic nuclear arsenals in what are now Russia and the United States had been destroyed then. But there was also a third important goal as well, which was to provide a berth in the European security order for Ukraine. As I was researching my book, Serhii knows this all too well because to his deficit, I basically barraged him with requests for names of interview partners, and I made him read early drafts in the manuscript, which is a fate no thinking person should have to suffer. But I was just shocked by how much Ukraine came up how early in this discussion. I'm paraphrasing, but the exact quotations are in the book. President Clinton would say things like Ukraine is the linchpin of peace and security in Europe. And so to recap, the big play was to square the circle of letting Central and Eastern Europe join NATO, keep the strategic disarmament going with Russia, and find a way to anchor Ukraine in Europe. Unfortunately, only one of those three succeeded, which was the first. The others did not. And what is for me really the tragedy of the book is that people at the time recognized that these were the three overriding imperatives. They also recognized that with three imperatives, what you really need to talk about is not squaring the circle, but squaring the triangle. And triangles, unlike circles, can be squared. And in the book, I talk about alternatives proposed at the time by leaders at the time saying, hey, these would be better alternatives that would allow us to accomplish all of these goals. Now, I'm happy to go into that detail if you want me to, at great length if you want, but that's the overview, is that the big play would have been to accomplish these three things. And there were people at the time who knew that, including, by the way, Clinton, and said, here are ways to do it. And that didn't happen. And so now we are no longer in peacetime. Now we are in wartime. Right now we have a new frame, a new bracket, right? Now these opportunities are gone. And what we have to do is live with the consequences of the Cold War, the fact that we didn't define a birth for Ukraine in Europe, that we didn't get rid of all these nuclear weapons. And that is really coming to the fore now. So that's really what the current crisis has imposed on me, is an awareness of these consequences of the Cold War.
That's great, Mary. And the only part I object to is when you brought math in, squares and circles. I mean, you have historians here. I don't know if it's like my trying to help Zachary with his calculus homework. I'm not sure. That was great. And I think those three competing goals really give us a way to begin to think about Cold War legacies in the post-Cold War world. Serhii, if I could come to you and ask a big question that follows from this, and it's something your scholarship has done the most to elucidate of any scholarship I've seen. Why this third pillar? Why is Ukraine so central in the late Cold War and post-Cold War world?
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And let's see how my voice actually fares. It's a question that we'll see the answer. We will see as I talk. So Ukraine is really at the center of this crisis, and that brought me back really to the late Cold War years. The story really begins there. The years of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, because the USSR fell apart on the issue of Ukraine, referendum in Ukraine and vote for independence of that republic. So the USSR was dissolved within 1 week after the referendum that took place on December 1st, 1991. And the reason for that was that Ukraine was the second largest Soviet republic in terms of the population and economic output. And since the very beginning, since the beginning of this process of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Ukraine presented an alternative vision of organization of the post-Soviet space, alternative to the one that was advocated by Russia. If for Russia, the independence of the former Soviet Republic really meant conditional independence, so conditional on good relations with Russia and de facto being a close ally of Russia. From the Ukrainian point of view and from Ukrainian perspective, independence meant independence. And this two visions, the clash of these two visions, that's very much part of the story of the post-Soviet space since 1990 or since 1991. Now, where does the Cold War, or what we know from the Cold War, fit in all that picture? One thing is that the United States in particular, they sided with the Ukrainian perspective and position. Again, it wasn't just Ukrainian, but it was articulated by Ukraine the strongest, that independence meant independence. that the Soviet Union was not supposed to become automatically the Russian sphere of influence, unless, of course, individual states, elites, peoples, and so on and so forth decide to side themselves with Russia. And from that point of view, what I see different about the Cold War in general, looking at it through the perspective of the current war, is that, in my opinion, the Cold War, or the Cold War I, really didn't end. It didn't end either in 1989 or in 1991 when it comes to the post-Soviet space. Because while there were agreements and understandings, written and unwritten, between Washington and Moscow on what would happen in the rest of the world, there was never such an agreement or understanding on the issue of the post-Soviet space. So just throwing the bridge from your question to me to the question that you asked to Mary, that's where this war, again, the war started really in 2014. Now we have the acceleration of that process, the all-out war. But what that war really made me to understand, to a degree that I didn't understand before, is that first, the Cold War didn't end everywhere in the world. The competition between the two nuclear superpowers continued in some parts of the world. Another thing that really came very clearly for me, that a lot in traditional historiography of the Cold War, a lot of emphasis has been done on communism as ideology and as failed ideology in general. And now I think whether maybe the role of the communists was overemphasized in the whole thing. Not the role of ideology per se, but the role of communism. And I guess I will stop here. But again, the war really provides a very, in a number of cases, on a very different perspective and different understanding of what we have been studying now for decades.
This is fascinating, Serhii, and I think we're all struggling as historians and observers with trying to understand what role ideology played. For so long, we as scholars had emphasized the role of ideology, but certainly if one sees continuities, as you're sketching them out, from the end of the Cold War to today, clearly there isn't a communist regime in Russia, right? So obviously the continuities cannot include that. And I thought I'd turn to you, Mary, because you've also written a lot about ideology in the Cold War. Do you agree with that point? Do you see continuity, or do you see this as something different, especially because of a different ideological framework than the framework we had thought about in the Cold War?
Well, usually when I'm asked this question, I shamelessly use an answer I get from Serhii. If I'm in a good mood, I credit him. If I'm not, I just take credit for it. And Serhii, this is similar to what he said, but slightly different phrasing. Serhii has written, I think completely rightly, the Soviet Union is still collapsing. So that's a slightly different take than saying the Cold War didn't end. I disagree with my good friend and great scholar, Serhii Plokhii, only with great reluctance, but I actually like his earlier formulation better, rather than just saying, oh, the Cold War didn't end. I think that the Soviet Union started collapsing, and I think Serhii is right that it is still collapsing. Empires don't just disappear, even though the Soviet Union in theory ceased to exist on December 25th, 1991. In fact, what we are still seeing is, the unraveling of an empire. Empires die long, protracted, messy deaths. And there's a lot of fighting over where they should end. And that, I think, is what we are seeing. That's slightly different than saying the Cold War didn't end. He also, Michael Kaufman has offered a version of that. He said, what we're seeing now are the wars of Soviet succession, the wars of Soviet succession. And I like that way of thinking it as well. So I do see continuity. I personally would not phrase it in terms of, oh, the Cold War just didn't end when we're talking about Russia. There's a little bit of a different case to be made with regard to the Communist Party in China. I know Adam Tooze has been saying for a long time the Cold War didn't end in Asia. That's a different discussion, which we can get into if the audience wants to, but I'm focusing on U.S. Russia. I think that because of the Soviet collapse, I think that there was a moment of rupture and a moment of transition, but that its consequences are still driving what we are experiencing today. And now we have come to a very dark point. We seem to have gotten onto a very dark timeline through that collapse. I believe other alternative timelines were possible. I agree very much with Serhii just said that Ukraine offered an alternate vision for the post-Soviet space. It would have been better for the world if that vision had succeeded. Allow me also to express my intense admiration for the Ukrainian people and the resistance that they are showing in the face of unspeakable brutality.
Yes.
It is really just hard to fathom how this country has been holding up so well for so long under such brutality. So I would like to say that. So I would say that there are continuities, but not at the level of everything's just like the Cold War, it never stopped. I know Stephen Kotkin has argued that too, another person with whom I also disagree with great reluctance. But I would put it more in terms of we are still living with the consequences of the Cold War that left so many unresolved issues. And sadly, those have now become issues that have ended in violence.
So Mary, I'm going to come back to you with a follow-up question, then I'll go to Serhii. I want to let him rest his voice a little bit. But on that point, I mean, you and I have both spent a lot of time studying Germany, and it seems to me it's hard to see the current Germany as a continuity from the Cold War, right? The Cold War, it was fundamentally about the division of Germany, and Germany is now a united Western player on a scale that was unthinkable. It seems to me that's a fundamental shift. And then the other fundamental shift from the Cold War was the set of nuclear rules we had, right? The set of rules for the use of military force. I mean, the thing about the Cold War, as John Gaddis and others have argued, is very quickly you have rules of the game that develop that actually keep the Cold War relatively contained, at least for the biggest actors. The Cuban Missile Crisis is perhaps the one real exception to that. So I just because I know you've written about these issues as I have, Mary, I'm just curious, do you see those as discontinuities, or do you still see continuities around the German question and around the nuclear question? And how do you think that plays in to the way you think about the current post-Cold War space that you're writing so well about?
Yeah, thank you. First on nuclear, and then on more specifically on Germany. Yeah, on nuclear issues, I agree. I mean, one of the frightening aspects of today's situation is that we seem, at least with regard to the U.S. and Russia, to have spun back up to a nuclear stalemate within the matter of months. Whereas, during the Cold War, part because the technology was being developed, that took months and then years and then decades. So there were time for people to build not just nuclear bombs, but also what I like to call guardrails, right? Arms control agreements or norms of behavior. And indeed, I actually wrote a New York Times op-ed about the norms of behavior that used to govern the Cold War. I'll pop that in the chat when Serhii is talking. So I agree with you very much on that point that we have this potentially nuclear conflict again, but we're missing many of the norms, treaties, even just memories, right? I mean, you and I, when we were young, we saw, the day after as kids. And so at some level, at some deep stratum in our personalities, we had an awareness of the risks of thermonuclear war. And that is just missing now, even though we're now back to nuclear threats between Washington and Moscow. On Germany is a more complicated question. Obviously, Germany used to be divided and now it's not, and so forth. So there's obviously a lot of changes. Germany, used to be the city where I'm sitting was, had foreign troops in it, de facto as occupiers, until 1994. The pullout was actually 94, not 1990. It was agreed in 1990, but it didn't happen until 1994. So obviously there's huge changes. But one aspect of continuity that is causing a lot of discussion where I am now, which is Berlin, is a German concept. I'll say it in German and then translate it. The German phrase is Wandel durch Handel. This is a somewhat untranslatable phrase, but roughly speaking, it means creating change on the other side in your enemy through trade and interdependence. So transformation through trade is a rough translation. And that
sounds similar to Ostpolitik.
Part of something what is known as Ostpolitik or Eastern policies. The Eastern policies, most made famous by Nobel laureate Willy Brandt. That's obviously a time period that Jeremy knows very well. And that belief has been constant through the late Cold War. Indeed, there was a belief that was part of why the Cold War ended and into the post-Cold War period. And so what is happening in Germany is a moment of profound rupture of leave-taking from that fundamental belief that has been continuous for decades. Indeed, when the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave his famous speech just 3 days after the war started, and on a Sunday, which is like unthinkable in a German context, like you can't even get milk on a Sunday, right? Olaf Scholz goes up on a Sunday and basically gave a speech that, before that, he gave a speech 3 days after the war that for decades before he could not have given. So even though united Germany, to recap, is obviously very different than divided Germany, there was the persistence of this idea of Wandel durch Handel. And now there's this widespread sense that failed. And when you have, a profound, widespread societal belief that fails, that causes a lot of disruption and consternation, and that's very much the feeling that I'm having here now. Also, just one little, PS to that. I actually was in Warsaw last weekend for a conference on German-Polish relations, which are rough right now. I was really disappointed to see that. I thought there would be more of a coming together in the face of a common enemy, but it's still at the level of the Poles saying, "Look, we were right. We told you so. Wandel durch Handel doesn't work. The Russians are always going to attack their neighbors." And the Germans are saying, okay, we get it, but we're transforming as quickly as we can. So there was a lot of friction in the German-Polish relationship precisely over the continuity of this concept. Did I stall long enough, Serhii, to let your voice recover?
Serhii, over to you. I wanted to ask about Germany in particular.
First of all, it's very clear that I have to work harder to provide some foundation for my thesis about the Cold War not coming to an end in the post-Soviet space. So I take this as a challenge, and I will be working in that direction. In terms of Germany, this is really the case where I learn on a daily basis from Mary and her writings and participation in common debates and discussions. Clearly, there is a turning point now in not just German understanding of what can bring peace and what can bring war, but in global, or at least in European as well. And there is a reassessment and reevaluation of the story that Mary wrote so wonderfully about the expansion of NATO. Because what the Poles are saying, of course, we were right, that we were trying to join the NATO, and everyone was saying, and I keep reading it today, that the Poles and other East Europeans trying to do that when there was no threat from Russia, per se. And that's where I look at that with a sort of disbelief, and I'm looking with that disbelief because I'm a historian. And in history, it doesn't, it matters a lot what is happening today, but there is also a broader historical context. And it was that historical context that actually made the Poles and the other East Europeans to act at that time the way how they acted. And that was the historical context that was completely obscured, not just for the Germans, for the rest of the world, because deep down, all of us, at least many of us, believed in some form of the end of history, some form of a major transformation, democratic transformation of Russia, democratic transformation of the international relations as a whole. It was almost like stock market getting to the point where it would collapse, and the voices are out there that no, this time it's absolutely different. The factors work differently, and everything is different. And you, as a historian, sitting watching all these things developing and knowing, okay, that was exactly the language that was used the previous time when the stock market went down. So the Poles, from that point of view, they learned their history, and that's something that makes them, of course, so righteous, maybe, in their relations with the Germans, who clearly got it wrong. And last comment, again, Mary mentioned really Brandt, and what we see there, it's also not just the beginnings of the Ostpolitik, it's also the beginnings of the trade. And the trade that actually made the Soviet Union and then Russia so much involved in many ways, positive and negative, with Europe and European countries and European markets. And what I see today from the historical point of view, it's a major rupture. There is a turnaround and reorientation also of that energy trade toward the East, which suggests to me that we are again witnessing today a very important turning point, both in terms of the foreign policy thinking in Germany or in Eastern Europe, but also in general in terms of relations and the future of the relations between Russia and now much extended body called Europe.
So this is fantastic and really gives us a lot to chew on. And I think, as always, right, there are parts of the Cold War that have continued and there are parts that haven't, right? I mean, this is the beauty of being a historian. It's not all or nothing. We don't need a parsimonious explanation. We can actually focus in on the complexity. We haven't talked about U.S. policy yet. And I think it would be interesting to bring that in, especially from a Central and East European perspective. One of the challenges during the Cold War is both the dependence of our American Western allies on the United States, but also the importance for the allies of having their own independence to some extent, and the importance for the United States of burden sharing. And so these are old debates, of course, that were, in a sense, brought up in a very disruptive way by the Trump administration. And I'm curious, I'll start with you, Mary, again, so Serhii can rest his voice. To what extent do you see the current debates building on prior debates about burden sharing, about the role of an alliance and the role of a hegemon versus the role of allies? How do you see those debates today drawing on or advancing debates from the Cold War?
You know, this is a good tactic on the part of Serhii to fake an illness and then make somebody else do all the talking. Yet more evidence of just how smart Serhii is. Yeah, I mean, interesting question. I'd actually be interested, Jeremi, given all your great ratings on U.S. foreign policy, I'd actually be interested in your answer to your own question. Obviously, what's old is new again, right? I mean, now NATO is, in the headlines all the time, and therefore NATO debates are in the headlines all the time. NATO has always had tensions and controversies, right? It's not as if there was a moment when everything was perfect in NATO. What is clear is, when you have a Moscow on the move, then it concentrates minds and creates unity and causes people to work together. I'm a little surprised it hasn't done that more in the German-Polish case, but as a whole, it has really brought NATO together. It has brought the West together. I think the Biden administration has been handling the Ukraine war well, which was a relief after the disaster of the Afghan pullout. And I think that the goal of unity will take priority for a long time over airing debates about burden sharing. But obviously, there's a lot of discussion going on internally of the distribution of tasks with regard to helping Ukraine, whether that's militarily, whether that means sending tanks, whether that's in terms of economic reconstruction. These are all, major headline issues again, and certainly they're being talked about here in Germany. So I guess I'm not saying anything particularly insightful, but I'm just saying these issues have been there and they've continued, but now they are headline issues again. I'd be interested, actually, Jeremi, in your take on that question, as I said, given your expertise on U.S. foreign policy.
Well, I think one of the key shifts that has occurred, I think there's a similarity in the differences. There almost always is, right? One of the key shifts, and I think I'm really interested to hear what Serhii says about this, is I do think that the importance of Ukraine in American thinking is much higher than it ever was before. Mary, you made the point, of course, that it was there at the end of the Cold War as well. But it's hard for me to think of any moment before where it received anywhere close to the same attention. It's unthinkable, the amount of aid that the United States is providing to Ukraine and the degree to which Ukraine really has become the center of American foreign policy and security thinking in the region. That obviously reflects a reaction to Russian aggression. But nonetheless, that to me is something that was completely unpredictable based upon the history of the Cold War. What I think is is similar, is just what you've written about so well, Mary, which is how NATO, which is an alliance that was built for a very different moment, for a very different set of circumstances, has now become an inherited architecture. It's sort of what we do with our universities, right? We have buildings that were built for other purposes, and now we're teaching different classes for different students with different technology in the same buildings because we have those buildings. And I think that's what's happened with NATO, which is, of course, a very important element of American foreign policy, the retrofitting of weapons for a new conflict, the retrofitting of alliances for a new conflict. And I think that's one of the challenges, even as NATO grows and seems to come together. It's not really designed.
Yeah. Actually, I can just jump in back in 1 second. I'll give Serhii another minute to express his voice. On the subject of attention to Ukraine, I agree with you, but there was a brief moment. It didn't result in the kind of military support, but there was a brief moment when Ukraine was born nuclear. Yeah. Right. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, as many of the people on the Zoom might know, it instantaneously became the third biggest nuclear power in the world, right? That gets everybody's attention, right? Bigger nuclear power than Britain, than China, than France, and those missiles were pointed at the United States. And so Jim Baker, Secretary of State at the time, went into his good friend and boss, President George H.W. Bush, and said, Mr. President, there is currently no other foreign policy issue more deserving of your time than this one. What is happening to those nuclear weapons? Where is command and control? Command and control was still in Moscow, but the Ukrainians were in physical possession of them. What did that mean? Also, although it was a much smaller number, Kazakhstan and Belarus were inheriting weapons as well. And Baker originated worry about what we came to call loose nukes. And so for that moment before the end game was Ukraine deciding to denuclearize, there was intense American interest in Ukraine. But then, of course, Ukraine denuclearized via the Budapest Memorandum. That's a whole other kettle of fish that we could get into if we want to. And so there was that other moment. But on the whole, yes, obviously, this level of military support is now unprecedented.
Well, and also just caring about the Ukrainian people. I mean, it's wonderful that we all care about them, but there's not a continuity in American interest in the independence and safety of Ukrainians 30 to 40 years ago as there is today. I mean, that's certainly been a shift. Serhii, this is your area of expertise.
Well, again, Jeremi, as you said, there is a continuity and there is change. And in terms of continuity, the closest parallel, at least in my mind, is really the focus that the U.S. society as a whole had in the early 1980s with regard to Poland and solidarity movement there. So it wasn't a war; it was a crisis not of the same tragic proportions. But there was something that went certainly beyond the White House and Capitol and the political elite of the United States. And what is in common there is that, like it was during the Cold War, now another area of contention is in the region that is called Eastern Europe or New Eastern Europe. So as the result of the transformations of the 1990s, the old Eastern Europe disappeared and the new Eastern Europe emerged closer to the borders of, or right on the borders of the Russian Federation. Another historical parallel that I have been thinking about, this is the definition, not of the Cold War, but of World War II as a good war. Mm. And it seems to me that what is happening in Ukraine gets as close in the American mind, at least the perception of the media, to the good war as it ever been since the end of the World War II. Because the hot wars that were fought during the Cold War, and you can look at Korea, you can look at Vietnam, because they had a very different ring to them. And this is the war, and it is very clear who is the aggressor, who is the victim. It is very clear on which side the United States of America, the people, the society as a whole, want to be and should be. And that's it seems to me something that really goes beyond the Cold War experience. The Cold War experience was of a different kind. And Finally, the comment on the burden sharing. It seems to me that again the war changed the dynamics quite dramatically. So Germany or many European countries don't need any more American president going there and naming and shaming them. Again, it wouldn't hurt still, but still, you look at the German military budget and plans to double it, right? So no naming and shaming would ever be able to produce that. And you see really the wave of rearmament that we didn't see since the end of the Cold War on all levels. And again, the big question what that means, where that would lead us, but that's a completely different climate in comparison to the one that we had before, when really the European members of NATO were trying to, when the bill was arriving, they were trying to leave the table and go to wash their hands.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful, and I think again that mix of continuities and discontinuities is very striking, and I am also struck, Serhii, by your point about this being another good war. You know, really since World War II, it's the first time you have such a clear aggressor. It's not that you don't have aggressors in other cases, but this not only seems to echo that, but to anyone looking at it, I know there are some people who disagree, but to anyone looking at it, it's the clarity of the aggressor, which you don't have in Vietnam, which you don't even in Korea. It's a more complicated story. So if I could follow up with you, Serhii, before I go to Mary, but before I do that, just remind our audience that we're reaching the point where we will go to audience questions. So please, in the Q&A section, please put up your questions. We'll have one more round ourselves here, and then we'll get to your questions, and I'll just read them to our panelists, and we'll move from there. So Serhii, are there lessons for how we think about diplomacy in the context of war today from the Cold War? There's obviously a discussion going on within Washington and within Europe and everywhere else. To what extent should there be negotiations? To what extent should there not be negotiations? What should negotiations look for? I'm not asking you for a policy proposal. I'm asking you lessons from the Cold War, which was a period of mixed diplomatic successes and failures between the East and West. Any lessons, anything you would take from that history today when talking to policymakers who are debating this issue?
Well, I would start with, again, parallels and particular similarities. The war in which the one of the great powers, those were superpowers during the Cold War, now they're just two nuclear superpowers, is engaged in the active war when the other side is trying to support militarily, politically, economically, and so on and so forth, the country that is under attack. Certainly there is nothing new there. We can look at the history of Afghanistan. We can look at the role that the Soviet Union was playing in Korea and Vietnam as well. So from that point of view, there is a lot that we can learn from the Cold War in the way of how this conflicts and major wars as well. The war in Ukraine is the largest war in Europe since the Second World War, so it's quite unprecedented. But still, there is there is a huge body of already not just experience that is there, but also writings and analysis and so on and so forth. And I think we should actually go back and look at what either ourselves or our predecessors were writing about Korea and diplomacy around Korea, about Afghanistan and Vietnam. So it's exactly as you said, this is not a specific policy proposal, but that's I'm trying to provide a direction where we can go and learn from that experience and also from our own research. Now, the differences are exactly, Jeremy, where you said that it was John Gaddis who said that there were rules of the game, there were rules of engagement, which were established quite early on. And this is not true today, to a degree that it wasn't exactly true around the Cuban Missile Crisis. Mm-hmm. Because what was happening around the Cuban Missile Crisis and what is happening now, you have really a revisionist power centered in Moscow that tries actually through the nuclear blackmail to change the disposition of forces. And it's very important to learn from the experience of the nuclear brinkmanship and Cuban Missile Crisis in particular. And really, I'm becoming more and more positive and excited about such thing that was rejected by almost everyone as mad mutually assured destruction. That there was in the definition of Churchill a balance of terror in the world, which seems to be disappeared. We unlearned how to be concerned, how to be afraid of the nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapons can keep peace together only if everyone, the other side in particular, is concerned about their possible use. If there is no such concern, nuclear weapons on their own, this is just hardware, they do nothing.
Yeah.
And that's again another area where we should look for parallels and for lessons.
Right, and it's such an important point because as we all know, and I think most of the people on this call know, right, there was so much effort put into educating the public in the 1950s and 60s about just what you said, about why nuclear weapons should not be used and why even as we're building them to create, as you say, a balance of terror. And just as is the case with the history of the Holocaust, too, as we move farther and farther away from that moment, a lot of that knowledge is lost. And, one takeaway, I think, would be that history is valuable, as you say, for educational points today, for people, policymakers, not just citizens, to understand these issues.
Absolutely.
Mary, on the diplomacy question, I think part of the literature, especially the German literature, right, is that you should always talk to your enemy, even in war. Do you take that as a lesson from the Cold War, and how would you think about what dialogue should look like today, even as we're in the largest war in Europe since World War II?
Yeah, I should say that the initial invading force in Czechoslovakia, when the Warsaw Pact moved into Czechoslovakia, that initial invading force was larger than the initial invading force here. That was not the largest invasion since the Second World War, but obviously this has developed into a much longer and more durable conflict. Also, given that my friend Serhii is now enthusiastic for MAD, mutual assured destruction, I think we're going to have to change Professor Plokhi's name to Professor Strangelove, which I'm sure will go down well with his students.
And the voice helps today. Doesn't the voice help for that today?
No, it's perfect. It's great. I actually was thinking, as Serhii was talking, I was actually thinking, I know you're asking a question about negotiating with the other side, but there was something that came up at this conference on German-Polish relations that I just went to that I would like to bring up in this context. And it's not so much about talking to enemies as about talking within the NATO alliance. So at the conference, one of the participants, a military officer, made the point that prior to February 24th, there were 3 tribes in NATO. The first tribe in the East believed it lived in a zone of existential threat. The second tribe in the South believed it lived in a zone of acute threat, and the acute threat was of immigration. And the third tribe, which was the rest of NATO, believed that it lived in a zone of eternal peace. And so the negotiations that need to take place now, this person argued, I think rightly, are between these 3 zones. And to try now, given that we have, all kinds of evidence that we're not living on a planet of eternal peace, as Serhii said, that, we mistakenly all a little bit believed in the end of history and it turns out to be wrong, are the negotiations between those tribes in order to create unity and how we move forward and then negotiate with Moscow.
Interesting. I like that. I'm just thinking through that model for thinking about the different factions, right? Within NATO. Okay, so we have some Q&A already. I want to encourage our participants to put their questions in Q&A. I'm going to go first to what I think was the first question, and also from a former student of mine who's now a professor at West Point, Ben Griffin. I'll give a shout out for Ben's new book. Reagan's in the news a lot these days with new books, right? Ben Griffin's new book on how fiction and Tom Clancy and others influenced Ronald Reagan's thinking about nuclear war, what Serhii was talking about. So Ben's question, after that advertisement for Ben, Ben's question is, to what extent do you think poor strategic assumptions about the end of the Cold War, strategic assumptions about a peace dividend, about a new world order, and I think Ben means mostly assumptions in the West, how did these contribute to the present state of conflict in Ukraine and Russia? What do you think? I know, Mary, in a certain way, your book is about this, your most recent book. Let's go to Serhii first, maybe, and then come back to you. Flawed strategic assumptions at the end of the Cold War, Serhii?
One thing that it seems to me quite obvious, that whatever peace dividend we got from the end of the Cold War, or at least end of the Cold War in Europe and in Central Europe, the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on and so forth, that it has been spent, and we are in a different world today. That's the world in which, again, I think what Mary was saying about need to renegotiate the whole situation within NATO, within the Western Bloc itself. It's an important need, and we don't know really where the events will bring us. What is quite clear for me right now is that there is certainly the rebuilding of the Cold War era transatlantic alliance, to a degree that it wasn't there for at least last 30 years, not just in terms of purpose, but in terms of coordination, understanding a common threat on the level that didn't exist before. We are also in a situation where a potential exists for the recreation and rebuilding of what was called the Sino-Soviet alliance of the 1950s. We know that it didn't last for too long, but it was certainly a major factor in the Cold War of the 1950s and 1960s. And this is again the story of that alliance, its rise, its fall. And then the American role in that fall are really very, very important and instrumental or at least I believe should be instrumental in our thinking about the future. So that would be this are the first thoughts that I had once I heard this question.
Mary, your thoughts?
Yeah, again, it's, I guess I would echo a lot of what Serhii said. And I think it's important to come back to his point of, we all at some level believed in the idea of an end of history, and that turned out to be a mistake. The big open question is, was there a moment where it would have been possible to establish real lasting cooperation with Russia? Or were we always doomed to end up back here? And I tend to side a little bit with the former. I don't want to say that there was some alternate timeline where everything would be wine and roses. That's not what I mean. But I guess that's part of why I push back against this idea that the Cold War never ended and it just continued and we were always doomed to be back here again. I feel as if there were a genuine moment in the 90s where we could have gotten onto, if not a timeline to a perfect future, then a timeline that is less violent, ugly, and horrific than we are on now. And indeed, that's one of the arguments that I make in the book, because there were people at the time making proposals for how to get there. And so I think that if there was one of the mistakes was not to think harder about that, to sort of assume that relations with Moscow were now going to be fine on autopilot and were not something we needed to work about. And then all of a sudden we're surprised when, they break down. So I guess, the lesson going forward is to not take the status quo as a given, to not assume that what's going on today has to be what's going on tomorrow, and to work to promote those aspects of the status quo that you want to promote.
And just along those lines, I think you've raised the important point about historical contingency, Mary. And just as it's hard to imagine, as you say, a path to enduring peace, we should remember that Vladimir Putin was in no way an inevitable outcome of the end of the Cold War. In fact, he was an unlikely outcome. You might argue you'd get some other authoritarian figure, but Putin is a particular kind of authoritarian with particular skills, actually. Or if I could put it, he's a particularly effective authoritarian. And that was in no way, those of us who were in Russia in the years of Boris Yeltsin, no one expected, even those who believed there was an authoritarian future, that it would be the Putin future. And so one can imagine many different paths just because of Russian internal politics that would look somewhat different from where we are today, that might have brought us to a different point. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Putin is in no way the inevitable outcome of any of this. This brings us to Hiroki's question, which is an excellent one and follows exactly where we are. Hiroki asks, how can we revisit and utilize historical lessons from the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship? Of course, William Bowden has just published a book on this. A number of us have written things on this. What in today's context, when speaking to undergraduates, for example, what do we take from the Reagan-Gorbachev relationship that's relevant today? Mary, let me start with you, and then we'll go to Serhii.
Yeah, I see. It's let me put it this way. I wish that Putin were more like Gorbachev.
Yeah, we all do.
It's hard to see, direct parallels. I obviously, it's a very general lesson, which is that Reagan and Gorbachev found a comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, found an amity that no one had thought possible. So that certainly offers hope. They showed what, two leaders can do to overcome animosity. So that certainly offers hope. The problem is that, I don't think we are in a moment with this war going on where, let me put it this way, either side really wants to have serious top-level negotiations. I think both Ukraine and Russia still believe at this moment that continuing to fight is in their own best interest. And with a situation like that, tragically, there isn't going to be an end to the fighting and a high-level negotiation, I think, anytime in the near term. So I don't think we're going to get to a scenario where you have, also it's different because here, obviously, that the Reagan-Gorbachev summits were about they were about many things, but at their core, they were about the thermonuclear standoff between Washington and Moscow. Here, obviously, it's the Ukrainians who are bleeding. So it's an uncomfortable fit for the Reagan-Gorbachev story. But there is the broader idea that, hope for the impossible, right? The impossible often seems, just that impossible until it seems inevitable, right? The Berlin Wall behind me, the idea that it would suddenly come down overnight seemed impossible until it happened. And then afterwards, everyone said, oh, it was inevitable, it was going to happen. It was just a matter of which day, So I guess that's the takeaway, but it's not a very, detailed takeaway. It's just a general spirit of keep hope alive.
Okay. Serhii?
Yes, I agree with Mary. We are not in Reagan-Gorbachev situation at all today. If thinking about the Cold War, I would think about a Truman-Stalin sort of stage in the relationship, and a particular stage in the relationship requires particular leaders and visions and tactics and strategies and so on and so forth. But looking at how this war is going for Russia, how it weakened the Russian Federation economically and otherwise, I have no doubt that Russia is for a really hard landing, and that there will be new leaders eventually that will try to actually think differently from the way how Putin and the current regime positions Russia and positions itself. And then the moment for negotiations again of some substantial character, is that the negotiations that would bring new sort of future would arrive. So I'm very positive in the sense that that moment would arrive. I'm very positive that it will again be there, but probably not very soon. And I'm sure it is not here now. When it arrives, what we can learn from Reagan, that it's actually extremely important to have a leader, American leader or Western leader, for that matter, who believes in things. And that is a strength. This is a power in its own right. And then, and economically and otherwise, and ideologically weaker partner in those negotiations is actually much likely would be in a position where he or she and the country would change track, start some sort of rethinking, start some sort of reforms that can bring lasting peace. So that's how I look at there. We're not there yet at all, but when the moment arrives, there is a lot that we can learn from Reagan.
This is a really important point. We talked about contingency. Another thing historians add to the discussion is the importance of timing. Certain things work in certain moments and not in others. And just as it took time to go from Truman, Stalin to Gorbachev, Reagan, we're going through a different arc of time, and we don't know where it's going to end. But there will come a point, as you say, when there will be a hard landing in Russia and there will be an opportunity for diplomacy. We hope that that's what we seek, not simply to make things worse. In that situation. We have time for a few more questions, I think. So I want to encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A area. We have one from Bailey Sigmund, which a very good question. Regardless of how wrong it is, Bailey points out many Russians, we all know this, think of their near abroad or think of the former sphere of influence as being an area they have some security interests in, cultural interests, political, economic interests. The United States, of course, thinks this way. We're always reminded by our foreign allies that we have a Monroe Doctrine. So how should we react to that? What does the Cold War teach us about that? Realists would argue that we should acknowledge a Russian sphere of influence. Then the question, of course, becomes, is that Ukraine or not? Others would argue Russia is not entitled to a sphere of influence. So I'm curious, again, going back to these debates, which are at the Churchill-Roosevelt moment going forward. How do you think about this? And maybe Serhii, maybe we'll start with you on this.
Sure. Well, I look at that big issue through the perspective of the probably one of the most important stories of the last 2 centuries in the world history, and that's the story of the disintegration of the empires. And the Cold War was very much, at least one of the aspects of the Cold War, was a competition between the 2 superpowers of how to manage the decolonization process, the process of the fall of the empires. The irony turned out to be that the Cold War ended with disintegration of one of those empires that few people actually suspected that it was an empire. And the current Russo-Ukrainian war is very often looked at as the war, the colonial war or the imperial war, an attempt to keep the breakaway province, the breakaway people or nation under the control of the former imperial power and authority. This is the story that we know from the story of the American Revolution, from the story of the Greek War for independence, from what happens in the Balkans and globally all over the world. And both in terms of geostrategy and in terms of the morality, if morality actually is the right category to apply to foreign policy, and I think it should be the right one at least. People believe in that, and I believe as well. Supporting the fight for independence against the former colonial imperial powers and authorities, it's not just the right thing to do morally, it's also the right thing to do historically. And we know what happened to the empires. We know where the whole process, where it is going. And we are talking here again, and not just about any sphere of influence. We are talking here about the collapse of the Soviet Union, which the Soviet Union was actually delayed in time, collapse of the Russian Empire that started in 1917. So that's at least the frame how I look at that.
Great. Mary, your thoughts on spheres of influence?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to think about the context. Obviously, now Russia has started a brutal war of aggression and has engaged in extensive war crimes, as revealed in places like Bucha and elsewhere. So it's one thing to talk in a peace period about, areas in which you want to promote your interests and have a sphere of influence, and it's quite another thing in wartime. We are in wartime. It's become clear that the only thing Putin understands is force. To put it very mildly, he is a bully, and so it's clear that the Ukrainians obviously now have a completely justified sense of nationhood and absolutely zero tolerance for talking about being a Russian sphere of influence as a result of what Putin has done. Before I went to this conference on German-Russian relations, I went to a foreign policy forum here in Berlin, which was for a broader European group of policymakers. And the Ukrainian representatives there said to the other Europeans, at this point, we can only accept the borders of 1991, given what we've suffered. So there's when the shooting is going on and the bleeding is going on, it's difficult to talk about things we might talk about in a peacetime context. I think there really are these moments in history which are really set apart from what came before and what will come after. I hope this war isn't going to keep going on like this. And so obviously that's the discussion of do great powers have spheres of influence. That's this huge debate that we're not going to resolve here on the Zoom in the next 2 minutes that we have left. But I think there's a question of the timing of raising that question. And right now, the people living in the sphere are quite understandably not willing to talk about that. Yeah. So I think it's an important question, but not for right now. I think the questions for right now are about how do we end the war and end the terrible suffering.
Serhii.
Just one thought as I was listening to Mary. It's more than the issue of spheres of influence. If the war starts with a pseudo-historical article which says to another nation, you don't exist, Russians and Ukrainians are one of the same people. That means Ukrainians are Russians. And that's how war is conducted. That is beyond spheres of influence. So just
right. No, I mean the argument for spheres of influence is precisely as you say, Serhii, that the big power has some influence but does not get to dictate and control. That's actually going back to an older notion of empire, not a sphere of influence approach. So the question I thought I would close on, Mary anticipated it actually, but I think it's a question that's a World War II and a Cold War question where historians actually have a lot to offer. We are, as Mary said, in a moment where I think there's overwhelming evidence that Russia has committed genocide, that there are war crimes of one kind or another. Genocide itself, as Samantha Power and others have taught us, is a post-World War II concept in the way we use it. And many historians, Francine Hirsch, many others, who spend a lot of time looking at the problems of Nuremberg and the problems in which war crimes are handled after World War II. We've had war crimes here on a scale even beyond what we had in Yugoslavia, I think. And there is going to have to be whenever this war ends or comes to some resolution, there is going to be a debate, as there already is, about war crimes. What lessons from Nuremberg and from the Cold War and even the early post-Cold War, the war crimes trials around former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, what should we take going forward? Again, not as a policy lesson, but more at least in how we talk about this. and how we think about just this issue today. And I think that might be, it's a dark note, but I think that might be a good note for us to close on, because it brings history and policy, and as Serhii said, morality and social justice all together around this issue. So, Mary, I'm going to go to you first, if that's okay, and then I'm going to go.
I think you should go to Serhii first. I want to hear what Serhii has to say.
Serhii, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. I can try. First of all, about the concept of genocide. The person who framed the word and developed the concept, Raphael Lemkin, lived a good part of his life in what is today Ukraine, in the city of Lviv. And so that's the area, that's the region where the developments of World War I revolution, World War II, put the issue of the genocide on his agenda, on the agenda of other lawyers who are thinking also in terms of the crimes against humanity and so on and so forth. And it's really very, very sad and disconcerting things that now we are back 100 years later in the same area, in the same region, applying the concepts that were developed on the basis of analysis of the crimes committed during the first half of the 20th century. Recently, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave an award to representatives of the human rights organizations from Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And Alexandra Matviichuk, the representative of the Ukrainian organization, gave, in my opinion, a very, very strong speech, which she was writing down in Kiev during the blackouts, sometimes without electricity and so on and so forth. She argues in that speech that we very much live in terms, when it comes to the war crimes, we live very much in shadow of Nuremberg. And again, that there is nothing particularly new about that. But what she meant was that we think about those trials that really come after the perpetrators, after the people who commit the crimes, who commission the crimes, they're defeated after the war is over. She puts forward a question about the necessity for having some sort of tribunal, some form of dealing with these crimes at the time when war still goes on. Of course, it's politically, international relations and so on and so forth can be quite problematic. But what I understand, the last meeting of G7, they already issued a statement in which they commit themselves to hold them responsible according to the norms of international law. People on the Russian side who are responsible for the crimes, or war crimes and genocide. In particular, the genocide is not mentioned. They're talking about war crimes, but who is mentioned Vladimir Putin. And this is, in my opinion, quite a turning point in terms of the thinking about the war and thinking about the crimes committed by Russian regime and Russian military.
Great. Mary, I think you're going to get the last word.
Yeah, I would second everything that Serhii said and say that what we're going through now ended an era without a name. It was the era after the Cold War and before COVID. We tend to refer to it as the post-Cold War era, which is kind of awkward. It was an era, I think, at some level of if limited optimism that perhaps we had moved beyond great power conflict, and that era is now over. We're still trying to understand what we're going through now, and there's going to be a lot of I hope this war ends as soon as possible. I'm afraid it won't, but I hope it does. And then there's going to be a lot of questions to be asked. One thing that is tragically apparent, which I guess as a historian is somewhat gratifying, just nonetheless tragic, is the relevance of history. Again, at a conference recently, I heard a military officer say, at first when the war broke out, we thought it was going to be the war, not of the 21st century cyber war, where everyone was fighting with cyber and bringing down everyone else's computers. And it didn't turn out to be quite that. And then we were worried it was going to be World War II and involve, the whole globe. And then now it's starting to look like World War I. And there's a feature on the front page of the New York Times today about digging trenches. And as a historian, I can only think, oh my God, not World War I again, right? Because it's obviously such an immense tragedy. But as a historian, I feel like, it's clear we have work to do, because all of these things that are not in living memory, but are in historical memory, are really becoming relevant again. I mean, who would have thought the big issue in a major 21st century European land war is, trenches and ammunition, right? That can even go back to the late 19th century. So there are just so many aspects of history that I think are relevant here. So I'm grateful to your organization and to Michael Kimmage, who's not here, for inviting us as historians to come talk about these issues.
Well, great. I just want to close with, I think, two themes that ran through our discussion, and they came very organically out of the discussion, but I think they're really important. One is that the past is still with us. And instead of it being about the past or the present, we have to think in terms of archaeology, right? There's a layering. And just as there are a lot of new layers that have been added on by new technologies, artificial intelligence, et cetera, by political changes, the old sediment is still there. And that sediment deeply affects, literally and figuratively, the ways in which this war is developing. And I think only if we begin to think about it that way do we get a fuller appreciation for what's happening before our eyes. And then the second theme, I think that was echoed in all of your comments. And then the second theme that I think came out really, really well here was the role of non-military factors. Of course, this is a military conflict right now. The Cold War was a militarized conflict. But there are many non-military factors, perceptions, nationalism, cultural assumptions, questions of justice, social justice, and they're often treated as soft power. I don't think they're soft power. They're actually the hard power in this conflict right now. Much of what we're seeing with the incredible courage of Ukrainians that both of you referred to is actually a kind of power that's a hard power based not just on military activities, but on these things we often called soft power. And I think we have to perhaps overcome that distinction. I think the soft power, hard power distinction itself was very much, Mary, from this unnamed period. Right. No offense to Joe Nye, but I think it was a very much, sort of a sense that we had moved beyond hard power. We could put hard power in one container and we could have soft power in another. And I think we've seen in this discussion that they're deeply, deeply imbricated, and the soft power is really not that soft. Otherwise, this war would be going very differently, it seems to me. So I just want to thank our panelists, thank Mary and Serhii, and for both from Berlin and without a voice doing this. I hope everyone is giving a round of applause wherever they are. Thank the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies. And I think we will see you all at the next of these webinars. Happy holidays, everyone.